Got that green button going?
There it is. We're live. All right.
All right.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Harvey, and I'm with the Tug Hill Commission in Watertown, New York. On behalf of the Constable Hall Association and the Tug Hill Commission, welcome to the third and final part of our live webinar series called the Constable Chronicles. This series explores the life of the Constable family and Constable Hall, otherwise known as the Jewel of the North Country, from a perspective with facts, some fiction, and family lore. Part 3, the evolution of Constable Hall in the 1900's, follows the stories of the last owners of the Hall and their family members. We will also see the impact that the changes in the village, the country, and the world had on them. Recollections from interviews with the last Constable family who lived at the Hall will connect us with joys, tragedy, and triumph of the era. And the quiz at the end is not to be missed. Okay, so you're all muted to reduce background noise, but if you have questions, please use the chat box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. And the webinar, yes, is being recorded and will be posted to our website when we're through. And finally, again, pay attention. There's a 3-question quiz at the end. And Marty will tell you about the awesome prize that you're going to win. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening, Martha Constable Murray. She is a retired English teacher and the daughter of John Pierpont Constable Jr. and who was the last Constable family member to own the Hall. Marty's book, Constable Hall A Story, is available at the Hall gift shop. Peter Hayes, the curator of Constable Hall, will also be joining us toward the end of the webinar to help field your questions. And maybe we'll see LJ. Who knows? We'll see. And now, without further ado, here's Marty.
Thanks, Jennifer. And as always, thank you to the Tug Hill Commission for allowing us to use your webinar to be able to present our history. For those of you who are coming back, thank you for joining us. For those of you who are new, I hope you had a chance to take a look at webinars 1 and 2 so that anything that I mentioned tonight about those webinars makes sense to you. If not, they are posted on the Tug Hill Commission page, and you can also get them on YouTube. So Jennifer mentioned our prize for the quiz tonight. And so I'm going to go over that a little bit quickly, just so you have an idea, and also hopefully you'll hang around for this wonderful prize. Some of you may recognize the name Tony Dumas. Tony is a wildlife artist who lives in Carthage, New York, and the Slack Chemical Company commissioned Tony to do a portrait of Constable Hall. And I'm going to hold this up the best I can to show this to you. And I'm hoping you can see it. Can you see this? This is what the portrait looks like. It is the Hall. It's a winter scene. And this is what we will be giving away tonight as our prize for the 3 people who answer the quiz questions correctly. Tony, as a wildlife artist, put deer there, but also he put a blue jay in the front. And my understanding is that my grandmother Constable always fed the birds, and the blue jays were her favorite bird. So to honor her, he included that. So let's take a look at what we're going to talk about tonight. In the second chronicle, we talked about the Hall through the 1800s until the death of Casimir in 1905. The remaining 42 years of the private ownership of the Hall basically is an untold story. It's almost a mystery. So tonight we're going to see how the Hall passed through 2 more generations and avoided the fate of so many historic buildings that declined and were destroyed. This is a story of inspiration that the Hall continues and prospers 115 years later. Along the way, we're going to see the changes in the country and the area, and we're going to listen to Constable family anecdotes that illustrate those changes. Those of you who sat in on my talk for the 200th may hear a few stories that sound familiar. I promise to keep them lively. I'd like you to just listen to this poem and keep this in mind as we talk about Constable Hall. Let the old houses keep their secrets keep. Leave them alone in their quiet sleep. They are like old folk who nod by the fire, glad with the dreams of youth and desire. So this is a recap. You've seen this before. This is where I came from. We had William Constable Sr., the purchaser, whose son, William Constable Jr., built the hall. His son, John Constable Jr., was my great-great-grandfather. We called him the gentleman. He was, remember the fig story in the garden? His son, James, was the architect. John Pierpont Constable Sr. was my grandfather. He was the inventor. We're going to talk about him. John Pierpont Constable Jr. is my dad. We're calling him the Preservationist. And then you have me. We talked about previous generations that owned the hall, and tonight we're going to talk about my grandfather, John Pierpont Constable Sr., who was Casimir's nephew, and I'll explain why he inherited the hall. We'll be talking about his wife, who inherited it upon his death. We'll be talking about my dad, John Pierpont Constable Jr., and then what my dad did to preserve the hall. So Casimir, if you remember correctly, what he called the scholar, and he died in 1905. And that was the era that you would experience if you tour the hall, or if you look at the artifacts at the hall. Basically, the hall is frozen in that 1800 era. The picture to the left is of Casimir and his brother James. And again, James is my great-grandfather. We'll be talking about him a little bit more. But I want to read you the description from Casimir's obituary. In his private life, he was a man of intense reserve and delicacy of feeling, a great lover of nature, keen in the pursuit of the sports of the forest, fond of fishing and hunting, and in his home devoted to the improvement of his estate and wrapped in the collection of rare editions of books. His garden was a source of great pleasure to him, and he was a devout member and warden of the St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Constableville. So when Casimir died in 1905, Jennie inherited the hall, and she lived there until approximately a little before 1920. Even though Jennie was from New York City, she seemed to love the country life, and she especially loved her greyhounds that you see in the middle picture here. And there were always plenty of other animals around the hall. In a 1915 census, Jennie was 78 years old. And the census also listed Lizzie Newhart. Remember her, Bob Newhart's aunt? Lizzie was 40 at the time, and she was listed as the companion. Mary Brody was 48, and she was the cook. And James Roach, 49, lived on and ran the farm for Jennie. There were very few relatives in the area anymore, and Casimir and Jennie had no children. The Constable family had dispersed to various places, and in particular, Philadelphia was one place. Anna Constable, the family suffragist who was active in the suffragette, I'm losing my train here. She was an active suffragist in the 1910s. She had moved to Philadelphia. Jennie's brother, William IV, was the one that owned Glimmer Glen, and he lived in Cooperstown. So she really didn't have anybody here other than Lizzie and Mary. And Jennie was sick for the last few years of her life, and her illnesses drained much of the money from the estate. And during the time that she owned the hall, she never did any updates. Around 1920, when Jennie was still alive, she passed the hall on to her nephew, my grandfather, John Pierpont Constable. He was James's son, and of course, James was Casimir's brother. Since Jennie and Casimir had no children, my grandfather was the logical person to inherit the hall. It would have gone to William IV, who was Jennie's brother, but he died in 1909. And my great-grandfather, James, died in 1898, so it went to my grandfather. So let's take a look at what was going on in Constableville at the time. Things were changing rapidly. And a few things that were changing also with the family were impacted the hall. Early male deaths made a big difference in the family, and it was difficult for the widows to maintain the hall and the estate. And Jennie is a fine example of that. There were fewer family connections in the area. The McVickers, the Pierponts had moved away, mainly because times had changed and the quiet rural life wasn't quite so popular anymore. People were more interested in the hustle and the bustle of the cities. And then bring into the fact that the Depression and 2 world wars had made economies of maintaining these old houses much more difficult. Properties all across the United States were being lost during these years. Glimmer Glen suffered a fire, was rebuilt, but eventually was neglected, and today it's gone. And if you visit many house museums today, you're going to hear how they probably narrowly escaped being lost. But for Constable Hall, there was intervention and it was saved. And that's the story that we're going to look at tonight. Changes that were happening all across the country were happening in Constableville too. If you remember in Chronicle 2, we talked about what the farm produced, all the cheese and the butter and Jimbo the bull and all of those things. Well, in 1870, the village had a population of 712 people. Let me tell you what all of the enterprises were that were going on at that time. And just imagine what a bustling place it would have been. There were 5 churches, 1 hotel, 8 stores, a bank, 3 blacksmiths, 3 wagon shops, cheese factories, plural, 2 other factories, 2 jewelry stores, 7 dressmakers, a doctor, a photograph gallery, a gunsmith, a barbershop, and of course, a brewery and bars. And this was the main street in the late 1800s. So things started to change. New inventions, new techniques changed everything, and the pace of life dramatically sped up. The population of Constableville dropped by half at that time, about the time Jennie took over the hall, 1905. And no new homes were built, but the quality of life improved. And what you're seeing here is how the water system that went in 1906. And the Italians that came up from Rome and from Utica are shown here digging the ditches for the water system. In 1910, the Model T arrived. In 1920, electricity poles went up. In 1923, telephone was being strung to the electric poles. And in 1923, the state highway and roads became paved and continued to be so throughout the 20s and the 30s. And Main Street changed in the village. Look at the difference that one generation made in the Main Street of Constableville. The top picture shows you horses and wagons and actually a little manure on the road. There's a wooden sidewalk. And the next generation shows you a paved street, cement sidewalks, curbs, cars whizzing by, an advertisement for Coca-Cola and the theater in Boonville, and lazy dogs were still there. All of these changes played a role at the hall also. So who is this? This is my grandfather. This is John P. Constable Sr., and we're calling him the Inventor, and rightfully so. He was born in Utica. His dad again was James, Casimir's brother. And James was an architect who grew up at the hall, went to Harvard with Casimir. He was trained as an engineer, but he went into architecture instead. And after working all around the country, he settled in Utica. And my grandfather was born December 17th, 1888. After an education in Utica, he went to Boston Tech, which became Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He graduated from there June 10th, 1913, and he studied naval architecture, a program that was established in 1893. And he also studied engineering. He was a member of Delta Psi fraternity. And a little bit of interest here, his roommate happened to be someone by the name of Charles Edison. Now, Charles Edison was the son of Thomas Edison. And Charles didn't graduate from Boston Tech, MIT. He went into the mining industry instead. He later became Secretary of the Navy and eventually governor of New Jersey. These are three different images of my grandfather. The one in the middle, we believe was a caricature drawn by a fraternity brother. And he went by the name Jack. And it says Jack and Clarice. Now we're guessing that Clarice is the duck. We don't know the story behind this, but it was done in 1910, so that would have been the right time for it to be when he was at Boston Tech. And then the picture on the right is my grandfather at the Edison Field Days, and we're going to talk about how he ended up at the Edison Field Days. So this lady is my grandmother, Constable, and she ended up marrying my grandfather. And what we know about her was she grew up in New York City, New Jersey area. She went to private schools. She wanted to be an opera singer, but her father said no. She also wanted to go to college and study mathematics. Her father said no. So what she ended up doing was going to what was then called the Chase School, which is now Parsons, and she took courses in textiles. She grew up pretty much in the New York City area. And one thing you want to know about her was, unlike Jennie, Mary Eliza, and Julia, she was not part of the tight family circles or the business acquaintances of those three previous wives of owners of the Constable Hall. They were married on April 16th, 1913 in New York City at Zion and Timothy Church. And I wanted to show you a little something, and I'm hoping you can see this. This is some signatures from some of the attendees. And if you can see the second, let me see if I can get this over here. Could you see that second little signature there? That says Charles Edison. We do believe that Charles Edison was the best man at the wedding for my grandparents. My grandfather worked at MIT as an instructor for approximately a year after they were married. And then he went to work for this man. Let me tell you a little bit about Edison, maybe some things you didn't know. Thomas Edison was married twice. The first marriage was his wife Mary was 16 and Thomas was 24. They had three children, Marion, Thomas Jr., and William. Mary died young, mid-20s, of congestion of the brain, which today we would know as a morphine overdose. Mary was being treated from some pain. We don't know a lot of the details about it, other than she died young. Thomas met his second wife, Mina Miller, with whom he shared a great interest in the arts at Chautauqua. Now, Edison was very hard of hearing and actually was deaf in one ear and hard of hearing in the other ear. So he taught Mina Morse code so that they could correspond. And actually, that's how he proposed to her. They had three children, Charles Edison, Theodore, known as Ted, and Madeline. My father and his two sisters' recollections of Edison was that he was an old man, but they wouldn't have met him until the 19-teens. And Edison was born in 1847. So yeah, he may have seemed like an old man to them because he would have been in his 70s. They said he wasn't very interested in children, and what they always heard was he was very hard to work for, that he gave engineers things to do, and one of those ideas was the phonograph. When my grandfather was working for him, and you see this is his business card here, working for Edison, he was the chief engineer at the Edison Labs in Orange, New Jersey, Menlo Park. When he was working for Edison, he worked on the phonograph, and he actually pulled one of them off the junk heap one summer, and they had music at the hall. I found a number of letters from between my grandfather and Edison at the Rutgers Library. And the topics are things like phonographic equipment and accessories, disc phonograph, testing, quality control, rubber and goldenrod, cylinder adjustments. You get the idea. I was unable to access any of these documents, but I'm sure they are fascinating to the right people. The letter on the right is interesting in that it is from Charles Edison to his father, and he addresses his father as Mr. Edison. Now, interesting thing about this is he's asking his father, what should they do about testing the phonograph that Constable is working on, the Amberola X. How should this be tested? And if you notice, he signs his initials and then he writes Charles in very big letters. Well, underneath this, his very deaf father says, let me hear it today. And he puts an even bigger letter than his son. Now remember, Edison was deaf, but he still wanted to hear that phonograph. These are my grandfather's tools. If you look on the left, that is his amp meter, his voltmeter, which would of course measure an electrical current. The tool in the middle is his measuring ruler. On the right is a caliper, and if you can look at those numbers, you can see that he was very precise in his calculations. He went above and beyond. And that's his slide rule at the bottom. And Peter keeps telling me that that was my grandfather's computer of the day. Let's take a look at that phonograph. This is the Amberola X. This is what my grandfather was working on. And it used cylinder records and it was hand cranked. We're going to listen to it.
When summertime comes round, you know you pack your bag and away you go to spend your summer holiday by the sea.
That was the music that they had at the hall the summer that my grandfather took that off the heap. And this note is quite interesting because this is when Thomas Edison terminated my grandfather, December 20th, 1920. Edison said, your work is of late is unsatisfactory and I request that you resign as of January 15th, 1921. He did, however, say, I will, however, continue your salary to March 15th, 1921. So he had a severance pay of approximately a couple of months and he allowed him to work through Christmas. So just to keep things straight here, because we're going to charge on through and talk about the generations that lived at the hall. Casimir was the scholar married to Jennie. Jennie inherited the hall when Casimir died. Because they had no children, it went to his brother James' son, John P. Constable Sr., the inventor, who was married to Wanda Michalis. They had 3 children. Wanda, named after her mother, John P. Constable Jr., my dad, and then Aunt Nancy, who at birth was named Anna, but she actually was always called Nancy. Now, looking back at Wanda, okay, instead of calling her Wanda Jr., we're calling her Aunt Bob's, and there's a reason for that. She was born in Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts, when my grandfather was still working at Boston Tech, MIT. She was born February 18th, 1914. And as a child, when they tried to teach her how to say the word baby, she couldn't say baby. She said Bob's. And that's what they started calling her. And I've never known her to be anything different. So I'm going to ask you to remember to call my Aunt Wanda Aunt Bob's. Whenever I refer to Aunt Bob's, I'm talking about my dad's older sister. My dad was born in Orange, New Jersey, August 27th, 1916. And I'm probably will be calling him Dad most of the time, or the Preservationist. And then we have Aunt Nancy, Anna. She was born July 15th, 1918, and she was born in Orange, New Jersey also. She was actually named for Anna Constable, the suffragist, And story is that my grandmother named her after Anna so that maybe Anna would leave her, Aunt Nancy something in her will, but that didn't happen. So we have Aunt Bob's, we have John, and we have Aunt Nancy. Let's move on. So when my grandfather was working for Thomas Edison, the family lived in Llewellyn Park in New Jersey. And they actually lived in a house called the Page House, and that was located at 124 Cleveland Street in West Orange, New Jersey. I looked it up to see if I could find you a picture of the house, and what is there today is the Cleveland Terraces apartment, this big brick complex of apartments. All three of the siblings described the development as an early development, that it was very exclusive. There were gates, a gatehouse, a gateman, and the trolley ran out front. Thomas and Charles had their houses there also. And Aunt Bob's was old enough to remember that Edison Sr.'s house, Glenmont, was a wooden Victorian mansion with a wide drive. And if you were known, you were just told to drive on through. She remembered Charles' house as being made of granite, and she thought that it looked like a prison. And again, Aunt Bob's was the one who had the most memories of being there. So one of the things that she told me about was she remembered one time when my grandmother was away, that my grandfather had a little party with a bunch of his fraternity brothers from MIT. And apparently they must have thrown their glasses into the fireplace, because she said there were always pieces of glass embedded in the fireplace after that. She also told me that Edison's daughter, Madeline, thought that her feet were too big, and she didn't want anybody to know that she had big feet. So she bought shoes that were too small for her feet, and then she gave them to my grandmother to stretch out for her. And then there's the bloody nose story. Aunt Bob's and Dad were sitting in the car one time waiting for my grandmother when she was in the china shop, and Dad gave Aunt Bob's a bloody nose. Now, Aunt Bob, it wouldn't have been so bad, except Aunt Bob's had on this pretty blue coat, and that had a little hat that matched it, that never matched again because they were never able to get the stain from the blood out of there. Kids, right? Who hasn't given a bloody nose to a sibling, or bloody something to a sibling? So Dad and Aunt Bob's remembered that in 1919, and again, Dad didn't remember it really, really well because he was only maybe like 3, but he kind of remembered that they took a trip to up to number 4 camp on the Beaver River. And what they did was they traveled by train from New York to Lowville. Then they took a Stanley steamer to number 4 on the Beaver River. And they had a nurse that traveled with them. And they had a little lavender basket that had a pillow in it, and that's how Aunt Nancy traveled, because she was only about a year old. And my grandfather had made a bottle cooler out of copper and zinc, and it had space for 6 bottles to keep the, and down in the middle, you would put ice, and it would keep her bottles cold. They rented the first floor of the building on number 4. And one of the things they did do was they went to have lunch with Jennie. Again, Aunt Bob's biggest memory of that was that they parked at the back of the hall, and Squeaky Martis, the gardener, was raking the driveway. You remember Squeaky, because he had that squeaky voice? Squeaky grew wonderful tomatoes. He was a cabinet maker, and he told Jennie everything. So you had to watch your step around Squeaky. Dad was too little to have a lot of memories of living in New Jersey, but what he did remember was he had a rocking chair, and he would sit there and rock on the rocking chair. He called himself Don Compy, C-O-M-P-Y. And he remembered one time that he was in the car, and there was a carton of eggs, and he was throwing the eggs to people at people out the car windows. And oh yes, he remembered the bloody nose story. And Nancy was too little to have memories, but also she was very sick as a child. She had German measles and chickenpox before she was 6 months old. She almost died. And then she also had osteomyelitis that left her legs bowed. And osteomyelitis is an infection of bone marrow. So she had a pretty rough start to life. So in 1921, after my grandfather's dismissal, they moved to the hall. And these are some pictures from that time. And Nancy looks a little older there, looks more like maybe around 10, 11 years old. She wasn't that old then. My grandfather finished up with Edison in March, although he had inherited the hall in 1920 from Jennie. So they decided to live at the hall, and my grandfather ended up working for Adirondack Power and Light in Glens Falls. He was a civil engineer, and what he was doing surveys of power possibilities for the small power companies. And the surveys showed water sources and that the dams didn't leak. And eventually the goal was to amalgamate Adirondack Power and Light into one company with another. And what they did was they tied in with GE, and that company became Niagara Mohawk. So in the move up to the hall, my dad, who was 5, rode with his dad up in the Studebaker, and which was a touring car, and they ended up staying at the Schwenk Hotel, which became the Hotel Parquet. Unfortunately, their furniture ended up in Constable, New York. And Constable, New York is up by the St. Lawrence River, north of Malone. And so it should have been in Constableville, and it was quite a drive between the two, but eventually about a week later, all of the furniture arrived. There were furnishings in the hall from Jennie, but my grandmother and grandfather also brought up things from Cleveland Street. So what had happened to Jennie? Well, Jennie had been ill. She was still alive in 20, and she had been hospitalized on and off and on and off. And the hall had actually been closed up for a couple of years. There's a couple stories about Jennie dying. Apparently there was a time that, Jennie was on her deathbed and everybody congregated and showed up, and she didn't die. So everybody went back to their respective places, and then, oh my gosh, Jennie's dying again. Everybody showed up. Jennie didn't die. So finally people said, just let us know when she's dead. And finally, Jennie did die in 1920. And the little story about Jennie's funeral, it was held at the St. Paul's Church here in Constableville. And those of you who know the church know that there is a heat grate at the front of the church. Well, apparently the undertaker put the casket over the heat grate, and Lizzie Newhart was there. And she was very concerned that that casket was over that grate, so she pulled the casket off to the side. Well, the undertaker pulled it back over so that it was centered, and Jennie pulled it back over. So there was a tug of war going on with this casket. And the minister that was doing the ceremony was brand new. This was the first funeral he had ever done. And this was not something he knew what to do with, how to handle it. Jennie left a very generous will, and at this time, a number of things were given away at the hall. And we often wonder if maybe this is what happened with some of the Clement Moore papers. That first year up at the hall, they had to put the Studebaker up on blocks, because if you know the North Country, you know there was snow. Dad said that they had to dig a tunnel from the back of the hall to get to the kitchen. They didn't go to school that first year either because of the weather, but they did go the second year, and they went to a school on one of the little back streets, and they would send a sleigh up from the farm to take the children to school. And sometimes they went on their snowshoes. Mrs. Higbee was that teacher, and she was not afraid to use that ruler on the knuckles in her inclusive K-12 classroom. Family folklore also said that my grandfather slept either down here or on the veranda that first year that they lived at the hall, mainly because he had allergies. So my grandfather started making improvements to the hall, and one of the very first things he did was to build a new barn. And this, you see the barn in process over here. And he did have electricity run to it, and that's what this arrow shows you here. One of the things that's kind of interesting here is you see the old barns here, the other barns. There were 5 barns on the original farm. And what Peter has found out in doing his research is that it appears that when they built the new barn, they actually took timbers from the old barns and incorporated them into the new barn. So what else happened there? Well, my grandfather built an ice cutting machine. Now, he had built a boat called the Goet, and here is the Goet. And he had sailed up the Hudson with this. He had sailed on the St. Lawrence with it. It was actually registered in 1913. Story is he built it in the Devereaux house in Utica, and in order to get it out of the house, they had to take the side wall off. So he made use of the engine from the Goet, and he created this ice cutting machine for on the pond. And it was hard work. And people from the village came and helped, and then they shared the ice. And if you look up in the upper corner, you will see that there are horses drawing the wagon with the blocks of ice, but also that the electricity had been strung to the buildings of the hall. Another thing my grandfather did was he enlarged the pond. There may have been like a little low-lying area there where some of the water from the creek flowed over, but it wasn't deep enough to make thick ice, or in case there was a fire at the hall, to be able to pump water. So what he did was he plowed the earth and he made that deeper. He also added a bathroom into the carriage house that was temporary, but it was there until everything was operative at the hall. And then the other thing he did was he put in a wood-fueled pipeless furnace. And my dad said they used to start the furnace in August and September to get the 18-inch thick walls warmed up. Do you remember that? There's a 6-inch layer and a 12-inch layer. So 18 inches entirely. And so Dad said by the time winter came around, the hall never seemed to be cold. So just to show you that the living there was like any other family, these are some Christmas decorations. Some of the furnishings are from Jennie, and you'll see the piano there at the end of the entryway. You see some of the animal heads. Many of them are not the ones that are there today. And you'll also see remember the buckskin jacket we talked about in Chronicle 2? This is where it traditionally hung, was on the back of the door out to the veranda. So what was it like living at the hall in the 1920s? Well, the picture on the left shows my grandmother and the 3 children in the drawing room. You see the fireplace and the fire going. My grandfather was traveling frequently, and Nancy had enormous health issues that took quite a bit of my grandmother's time. But my grandmother found the time to be the vice chairwoman of the Village Home Bureau, and she also helped found the Constableville Library. She had teas at the hall, and she also planned to open a luncheon room. She seemed to enjoy local society, and she didn't seclude herself like Jennie and Mary Eliza and Julia did. She interacted with the people of the village. So what was it like for the kids living there? Well, my dad was a little older, so he had some stories. Aunt Bob had stories, but Aunt Bob said it was culture shock for a girl coming from a city, and there wasn't anybody for her to play with. She said she liked living in the country, and she kind of felt like an English squire's daughter. Jennie hadn't allowed visitors to the hall, as you know, and people were a little hesitant and reticent about visiting. They also thought the hall was a long ways away. It was about a mile. She did go to the public schools, and as did her brother and her sister when she was old enough. And one of her greatest memories was the fact that her father's birthday, being at December 17th, was deemed to be too close to Christmas. So the family celebrated his birthday in September. And they had a roast beef dinner with mushrooms. So the kids were sent out to get mushrooms in the field, bushels and bushels and bushels of mushrooms. Aunt Bob's hated and never ate mushrooms after that in her life. One of the other things that Aunt Bob's remembered was, remember I mentioned the milkweed in the notes with Edison earlier. My grandfather worked on making rubber out of milkweed. And she remembered going out and gathering the milkweed out in the fields. Henry Ford was doing the same thing at that time. If you look at this picture on the right, see if you can pick out my dad. Dad said the children had chores. They made beds, they did housekeeping. And one of Dad's jobs was to make sure that the Holstein bull behind the shop had water in his barrel, his 50-gallon water barrel. Dad had to take a bucket over to the pond every day and fill it up with water, pour it in the 50-gallon barrel, go back, get another bucket, back and forth, back and forth. And he said, invariably, as soon as he filled the barrel, the bull would stick his head into the barrel and tip it upside down over himself, which meant Dad had to start all over again. He said sometimes he had to do that twice a day. Dad also had tree houses up in the pine tree outside the pantry. And because Nancy had trouble getting around, they had boards up for her to be able to scoot up to get up there. And he remembered one time that they were getting ready for a really nice formal dinner. And instead of scooting down as she normally would, Aunt Nancy slid down. And when she did, she got splinters in her legs. And my grandfather had to take her to Utica to get the splinters out. Art, the gardener, took the tree houses down. One of my dad's best or worst memories, depending on how you look at it, was his visits to the farm. Bill Colligan was running the farm, and my grandmother wanted turkeys. So on a rainy day, my dad thinks he was 7, 8 years old. He was down at the farm, and Bill bet him 25 cents that he could not suck a turkey egg. So they got an egg, punched a hole in the bottom. You know how big a turkey egg is? You know, like this. And it was warm. Keep that in mind too. They punched the hole in the bottom and Dad sucked that turkey egg down. He said it came back up as fast as it went down, but he got his 25 cents. Dad and Aunt Bob spent a lot of time with Pearl Teller Walsh, who was the cook, because their mother was gone quite a bit of the time with Nancy, who was not well. And Pearl became like a surrogate mother for Dad and Aunt Bob's. Pearl's dad was the harness maker in the village, and Dad said he loved the leather and tallow smell that accompanied Pearl. So if you're not sure which one was Dad, I'm going to show you. This is my dad right here, this little guy. Looks a little shy, doesn't he? So what did Aunt Nancy remember about living there? Well, she was 3 when they moved to the hall, and she had the osteomyelitis, and by age 5, she had had 5 operations, Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, etc. And her parents had been told that she would always be an invalid. However, her legs were straightened by a doctor in Utica. She remembered Dr. Baldwin and that he had a perfume that put her to sleep. After that, she was in hip casts and couldn't turn over. So for about the next 4 years, Granny turned her over in bed. And after that, when they took the braces off, she had crutches, and she called her crutches patties. Now, despite her crutches, Aunt Nancy seemed to be able to get into trouble. And one of the things that she did was a little trick she learned from Peter Rattle. Peter Rattle worked around the hall, and he had a wooden leg that rattled. And he taught Nancy how to eat peas off of a knife. And so Nancy, at formal dinners, would eat her peas off of a knife, probably not pleasing my grandmother. Another time, Nancy got mad at Aunt Bob's, and Aunt Bob's doll disappeared for about 12 years. When a wardrobe was moved, guess what? There was the doll. And how else did Nancy get around? Well, when she was inside the hall, when it had the casts on, they would put her in the dumbwaiter. The dumbwaiter runs from the kitchen up to the pantry. So they would just put her on the dumbwaiter and they would send her on up to the first floor. And my dad pulled Nancy around in a wagon. And one time Nancy wanted a kitten. Well, the town people found out about it, and about 100 of them showed up at the house. They had a dog named Rusty, which is kind of interesting because my daughter has a dog named Rusty, but Rusty was a golden retriever. Their Rusty was a golden retriever. They also had a collie named Santa. And Santa used to play a game called Hat and Mittens with my dad, which I have no idea what it is. If you know, please tell us in the chat section what it is. They also had a tailless cat named Humpty Dumpty. He lost his tail in a lawnmower accident, but that did not stop him, or did not stop Aunt Nancy from dressing him up in doll clothes. Oh, and other wildlife. There was a skunk family that lived under the carriage house. Mama skunk and her babies would parade up the steps at one end of the veranda, across the veranda, and down the other side. And invariably, they would do this when my grandmother was hosting one of her teas. In 1924, the family moved to Glens Falls for just 1 year. My grandfather was still working there. And so they moved there to be near to him. And in 1925, they lived in Lowville on Park Street for a bit. As I said, my grandfather maintained his business partnerships in Glens Falls. And unfortunately, on just October 31st, 1926, he was killed in a trolley accident. That event changed everything for the family. At the time of his death, Aunt Bob's was 12. My dad was 10. Aunt Nancy was 7. The family didn't find out about his death until the next day, November 1st. They didn't have the kind of communication that we have today. And of course, it was devastating to know that their husband and father was dead. So my grandmother had to make a decision. She was from New York City and had really no attachment to the hall other than having been married to my grandfather. For the next few years, she retained the hall, yet she only visited on occasion. And her home base became New York City, where she was involved in various social activities. She visited Europe, and I'll be explaining to you why she made visits to Europe. And eventually she did move back to Boonville, where she died in 1972. Shortly after their father's death, the children's grandmothers, Grandmother Michalis and Grandmother Constable, came to the hall and decided that the best thing for the children was to follow family tradition and to send them to school in Europe to be educated. Aunt Nancy and Aunt Bob's went to school in Paris, and then they went to school in Florence, Italy. The school they went to in Paris was the, pardon my French, Lycée Victor Duray, which was in the Cour du Parc Monceau. There were 1,500 students, and the school itself was near the Versailles. It was pretty much a finishing school, and they took French elocution lessons, as they did not speak any French at all. They also took tennis lessons and dancing. The Rodin Museum was nearby, but the girls weren't supposed to go there because they weren't supposed to look at the nudes. But Grandmother Michalis took Aunt Bob's to see the nudes. Aunt Bob said her favorite dessert was pain au chocolat. The picture in the middle is a picture of my dad, Aunt Bob's, and Aunt Nancy in Florence. When the girls went to Italy, they went to the Poggio Imperiale, which was a palace in Florence. The Belgian Crown Princess was there when they attended. The school lasted 9 months of the year. They had 8 days off, could not leave for Christmas or Easter, but they could have visitors on salon days, during which they had to wear white gloves. Every Sunday was a holy day. And they had uniforms, and these are the uniforms that they're wearing. Aunt Bob's uniform was number 71. Aunt Nancy was number 72. The uniforms had belts. Green meant a new student, and red meant an upperclassman. They had to walk 2 by 2 and had guards at the front and at the back. Mussolini's daughter also attended the school while they were there, but she didn't like being treated like the same as the other girls. So her father came and picked her up. But Aunt Bob said the uniform did open doors and paths for the girls. And one time they actually were allowed to see Mussolini speak. And she described him as horrible and that he yelled. So a little event happened in October of 1931. My grandmother and Aunt Nancy were sailing back to the United States on the steamer Excelsior. And during the voyage, there was a little bit of excitement. The captain discovered a stowaway and put him ashore on a barren island. Well, this made the crew just a tad restless, and along with some bad food and a fight, gunfire and mutiny ensued. The ship did dock in New York, met by the New York police, who were actually there to arrest another passenger, a New York banker. So Aunt Nancy, as the youngest, ended up spending more time around Constableville than my dad and Aunt Bob's. And she stayed with the Schwenk family, who were neighbors, after school when she was in the area. And on the left, you see her playing with the neighbor. And actually, that is our curator, Peter's mother. In 1937, Aunt Bob's became engaged to Warren Crane. And they actually married on February 18th, 1937. Now, if that date sounds familiar, that is because February 18th, 1914 is Aunt Bob's birthday, but coincidentally, February 18th, 1914 was my Uncle Warren's birthday also. Never forgot those birthdays and anniversaries, did they? So this picture in the middle, what is this all about, this plane crash? Well, it appears that in September 1938, Aunt Nancy and Dad were at the hall by themselves, and a friend of Aunt Nancy's from Rochester, Aunt Nancy was working in Rochester at the time at what was then Haloid Corporation. You may recognize Haloid Corporation became Xerox. A friend of Aunt Nancy's flew up from Rochester in his plane for a weekend visit. At 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning, William Stevens, the owner of the plane, and Aunt Nancy were landing on the north end of the field when the plane accidentally struck a cherry tree. Now, Stevens said they had their seatbelts on, so they didn't fly into the air. We never see Stevens mentioned again in any of the family records after this event. But we do know that a friend of Stevens drove up from Rochester with a truck. They dismantled the plane and they took it back to Rochester. And Aunt Nancy never flew again for the rest of her life. She refused to get on an airplane. Great family portraits, huh? These are probably from the time the family was at the hall part-time, thinking that Dad probably was at Kent and that Aunt Nancy again was spending time with local people. Aunt Bob's was with her husband in East Orange, New Jersey. So the hall was occupied part-time, mostly by my dad and Aunt Nancy in the 30s and 40s, because my grandmother was in New Jersey and Aunt Bob's was married. Arthur Weston was a good friend of the family, and he was the caretaker. This is Art on the left. In 1933, the hall was broken into and only one thing was stolen, a very valuable rug. With all of the other things that were there, Duncan Fife furniture, etc., the only thing that was stolen was a rug. If you look at the cars on that picture on the right-hand side, they're parked in front of the laundry house. Remember the laundry house where the coachmen used to sleep, but they also would do the laundry? Well, it's kind of interesting that today when we have the cruise in, that the cars actually park in front of where that laundry house used to be also. And often in the 40s too, late 30s and 40s, when the young people would come up to the hall, they would stay at the Hotel Parquet. This is actually a picture of my dad and my mom. And that is Aunt Bob seated out on the porch of the hotel parquet. This is the Preservationist. This is John Pierpont Constable Jr. This is my dad. And he is the one that eventually determined the future of Constable Hall and why we call him the Preservationist. His love for the hall probably started from his boyhood times here, some of which were recounted earlier. He didn't have much of a childhood in New Jersey, so most of the 5 years or so that he actually did live at the hall were very important to him, and he had great memories of that. His dad died when he was 10, so he was here for about 5 years, and his grandmother Michalis took him and Aunt Bob's to Versailles that summer in 1926 for a visit, probably to get them signed up for school also. They were sailing on the SS Patria, which was a French line, and the trip took about a week, and Dad said he was seasick the entire time. Dad spent 2 years at a school in Paris, the École Pascale. Dad was one of 2 students there from the United States. Everything was spoken in French, thought in French, everything was lived in French, and Dad did not speak any French, knew none of the language. And he said it was extremely tough and traumatic time for him at 10 years old. He always felt that he lost a lot of his schooling because of the language barrier. And he also lost contact with his friends at home and with his country. He was confirmed at the American Cathedral while he was there. After those 2 difficult years, he was sent to a school outside of Geneva. And it was an all-boys school. Almost everybody there spoke English and had all male teachers. And he said that was a much better situation for him. And he felt like he was able to catch up some on his education. And after each of the school years, he spent time at the hall. He was accepted to the Kent School in Connecticut for the fall of 1930, and he was there until 1935. So check out this hot rod. I guess in the 1930s, the young men were snapping up those Model Ts because the newer models of cars had come out. And so Dad had a Model T that he was driving around. That is Aunt Nancy with him right there. Can't make out who that is. It does not look like Aunt Bob's to us. We've all, used our little microscopes and whatever to take a look at it. But this was Dad's buggy that he drove around in the summer. And this is a little artifact you probably won't see too many times. Apparently one of Dad's classmates went to Antarctica and sent Dad a letter to Constableville. So it was mailed on January 31st, 1934 at 8:30 p.m. It arrived in Constableville on April 4th, 1935. So it only took a year to get from Antarctica to Constableville. In 1936, at age 20, my grandmother turned the hall over to my dad. There was no accompanying checkbook, so my dad had to figure out how he was going to maintain the hall. So he started to work. He worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, dredging on the Hudson River. That was his first job, and he said that was where he learned a lot of salty language. He also worked for Wrigley and Lifesaver companies, and they listed his residence as Constableville. And this vehicle is what my dad drove. Yes, my dad drove this vehicle with a great big Lifesaver roll on the top. After that, he went to work for Revere Copper and Brass. Dad was at the hall when the radio announced that Pearl Harbor had been attacked and that World War II had started. He was number 10 on the Lewis County draft, but that was not what caused him to enlist. It was a sense of patriotism and wanting to serve his country. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in January of 1942. He was sent to officer candidate school and eventually was stationed at Rosecrans Field in St. Joe, Missouri, before he was sent overseas. He was what was called a CBI overseas: China, Burma, India. He served in both India, and the majority of time he was in China. He was in his promotion in 1944 to captain, it referred to him as owner of historic Constable Hall. After his discharge in 46, he remained in the reserves until 51, and he reached the rank of major. So imagine taking charge of the hall at age 20. He spent as much time as he could there, and he was also working to put money into it and to maintain it. So basically he was there on the weekends. And while he was away in the service, of course, he wasn't able to do anything. There were caretakers that kept things going while Dad was away. But the hall required many changes and updates because the world had changed and had become more modern. And some of the changes that his father had done needed to be updated also. If you take a look at the driveway here on the left, you notice tire track ruts that probably weren't there when they were driving in and out with wagons and carriages and horses. So what was Dad to do? He was discharged from the Army in 1946. He had married my mom, Miriam Bisnet, from Watertown in 1943. They had one daughter, my older sister, Jane, and Dad was now involved in helping run Mom's family's business in Watertown. The hall was 50 miles away. He couldn't be there all the time. Plus he had these other obligations. And the hall, as you can see in this picture, needed extensive repairs. It had fallen behind with the changes of the decades. The structure was sagging. The electricity needed updating. Plumbing needed updating. So did the heating. And it was difficult to update such an old stone building. As a young father and husband, he needed to make a decision about the building that he loved so very much. This was a time when Constable Hall could have been lost, like so many of the historic buildings that I mentioned to you earlier. Dad had opportunities to commercialize the building. He had opportunities to turn it into a bed and breakfast kind of situation, into a hotel, into a restaurant, and he turned all of those down because he knew this was history and that the history needed to be preserved. He actually had looked at having Lewis County take it over and use it as a museum, but that deal fell through when there was a fire in the county, and Lewis County had to withdraw their offer. So what was to happen to the Constable Hall? If you remember from Chronicle 1, Molly Lewis and the Cornwalls stepped in. Now, Molly Lewis was at a tea hosted by my grandmother in June of 1926. Little did she know that 20 years later, she and her husband Harry and her sister Grace Cornwall would purchase the property and the furnishings with the help of many other peoples, especially the indomitable Mrs. Roy Shaver. The hall was repaired and furnished and restored at their expense. And my dad lent some items for display also. On July 19th, 1949, the Lewises and Mrs. Cornwall presented Constable Hall to the Constable Hall Association for continued operation and to, quote, love and cherish forever. Thus you see why we call my dad the Preservationist. So these are some pictures of what the Constable Hall Association does. It's a nonprofit, and its mission is to preserve the hall, give tours, and promote events. It's been around for 71 years now and has hosted approximately 100,000 visitors. It's all volunteer and community supported, as the hall is not a state nor a federal museum. This is a picture of my dad with my cousin Susan Kernan at one of the arts and crafts fairs. And many of these pictures are from the arts and crafts fair, the cruise in. There's the board sitting out in the workshop at a meeting. For a number of years, Dad found it hard to be involved after he had sold the hall, but he eventually became very involved. And at one point, he actually served as president of the board. He died in 2006, but his 4 children, of which I am the youngest girl, but not the youngest child, have stepped in, and we do a lot of volunteering. We help out. We do whatever it is that we can to support the hall. This is probably one of my favorite pictures. This is the 4 of us standing on the steps of the hall just before the 200th celebration in July of 2019. This is my brother, John, Pierpont Constable III, who is the board president. This is my sister, Jane Constable Rockwell. This is my sister, Mary Constable Crouch. And Mary is a vice president and also runs the gift shop. And that would be me. I guess I'm the spokesperson here. So beautiful pictures of the hall, the pond, the hall, and the magnificent garden. There was a newspaper clipping in 1900 that still applies today. Constable Hall holds an honorable place among the remaining homes of earlier America. Decay has never been permitted to place his finger upon it. Loving and constant affection and care protect it. Turned into its 2nd century, it bids fair to continue into its 3rd and to subsequent ones. Like the manor houses of England and Ireland, from which it has borrowed its serenity, its dignity, and its mellowness, it cannot age. It smiles at years and laughs at mere decades, long since it became ageless. You recognize this slide, of course, just telling you who we are, the mission of the hall, and asking you to consider some way that you can support the hall, whether it's a visit once we get open again, and we will open, whether it's becoming a member. Membership is reasonable, and what a great Christmas gift, or volunteering. We are always looking for volunteers. And I have mentioned before, my friend from Florida who wants to come up and work in the garden. There is our website, and we are also on Facebook. And Jennifer, are you there? Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. There's nothing like hearing the more modern story from someone that's heard the stories and heard them herself. So
Yeah.
Thank you. It was very heartfelt, and
It's a hard one for me to do.
I know, and I'm glad the camera was off because I was feeling it with you. So thank you so much.
It's hard, but it's wonderful, and I'm so excited that the number of people who have joined us tonight have joined us and get to hear this story, because again, it hasn't been told. It's 42 years of family history that really hasn't been told. The other stuff, a lot of it you can find in history books, and if you visit the hall, you hear through the Casimir era.
It's still different, and it's still special coming right from you. So
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Where's our questions? Who's got questions for us before we get to the quiz? Any questions for the chat box? Comments? Wow.
Not yet.
Quiet. It's a quiet crowd tonight.
That's okay.
Maybe
Well, a lot of things they know, and it other than some of the news stories, but a lot of the other stuff that we reviewed. Yeah.
All right then.
So just a reminder, if you are still with me, I have trouble. Can you see this?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, you can you see the blue jay?
Yep,
There he is.
there's the blue jay.
And the deer off to the side there in front of the hall.
Mm-hmm.
Tony
Yep.
called this the night before Christmas.
Oh,
Yeah. If you don't happen to win this tonight, these are available through the gift shop. You can go, you'll be able to go on the Facebook page and grab one that way.
I'm looking at the chat box. It just kind of blew up here. All right, got some thanks. And yes, Pam says she'll be around next summer for the garden.
Pam, yeah, she's coming up from Florida. She promised.
Patrick Clark says all the ancestors have nicknames. What will we be calling Martha? So like the inventor, right? The preservationist.
The wordy one.
Tom Voss wants to know, was the hall, was it actively farmed through the early 1900s?
I can answer that one. The
And
farm
for
is
those of you
actually
who haven't
still,
met Peter before, this is Peter Hayes, our curator.
the farm is still actively being farmed to this very day. About 2 weeks ago, I went with my neighbor and owner of the farm, and we toured the barn and looked at a lot of the different outbuildings. And so he actually is still farming. So it was farmed actively through 1948 for the Constable family. And then during the time when it was sold to the association, the farm was split off and has been privately owned by about 6 or 7 different owners since that time.
Interesting. Your siblings, Martha, are they all local or in New York, or
What's that?
your siblings?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
yes. Actually, my brother lives in Champion. My sister Mary lives right up the hill on Crowfoot Hill here in Constableville. And my sister Jane lives in Pulaski. I live in Rochester, been spending most of my time in Sackett's Harbor.
Great. Question from Kate. Did Grandpa ever tell you his favorite memory from the hall?
Boy, I don't know if there was a favorite, Kate. I mean, the one about the turkey egg really was the one he remembered the best and had the greatest amount of detail with. I know he loved his tree houses, and he talked about that, like if he got into trouble, he could get up in the tree house and then he could look down the driveway and wait to see when his father came home. And then he knew it was safe to come down.
Fun. Marty, were you named after family members, or were any of you? I mean, obviously John, yes.
No, Jane, my sister Jane was named after my mom's best friend, her college roommate. Mary, I always tell people I have a sister Mary, I'm a Martha, but no brother Lazarus, because I'm not exactly sure. It was just names that mom liked, I think, and mom and dad agreed upon. My middle name is Ellen, which was my mother's. So yeah, that's the best I have for you.
All right. Jean suggested your name should be the historian.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Although Jane has a lot more information than I do.
Lots of notes of thanks in the chat. You can take a look at those. All right. I think I've got all the questions though. Oh, Tom. Okay. Do we want to go on for the quiz?
Shall we do this?
Let's do this. Let me get my phone ready.
Yep. So we're going to do what we did the last time. Because a lot of people said they couldn't type the answers fast enough. So we are going to have you call Jennifer at her phone. She's in her office at the Dulles State Office Building. So you will be calling her direct line there. She came out on a wintry night, and we certainly do appreciate that. And her number is area code 315-785-2392.
I'm gonna mute myself for right now.
Mm-hmm. We'll give you a minute to get that punched in, whatever. There are 3 questions, and what we'll need you to do is give Jennifer your answer. The first person with the correct answer will get one of the prints. Again, they don't come matted like that, but they are on a piece of foam core. We're just waiting on Jennifer. Are you ready? I hope these aren't too easy. But okay, number one. Who was my grandfather's roommate at MIT and his best man at his wedding? Ding-a-ling-a-ling.
Okay, so that was Pam Clark.
Oh, Pam.
Right answer, Charles Edison. She says she loves you and misses you.
Okay, congratulations, Pam, and thank you. Okay, folks, we got two more to go.
Voicemail. Okay.
Two more to go. Wait for the question. Okay. What was one improvement my grandfather made to the hall? There are a number. What was one? Just one we're looking for. One improvement my grandfather made to the hall.
I have Marjorie on the phone and she gave the answer of electricity.
Yes.
One of them.
You put electricity. Do you have her address? Yes, Marjorie is absolutely correct. Other answers would have been he built the ice cutter. He put in the pipeless furnace, the temporary bathroom in the carriage house. He enlarged the pond, and the big one was the new barn and adding electricity to the barn. Okay, you are ready. Okay, this is number three. How old was my dad when my grandmother turned the hall over to him? Ah.
It's Barb Michalis and she's 20.
20, yes. Dad was a mere 20 years old when he became Lord of the Manor, I guess you would say. A young man. I'm trying to think at 20 years old, I was in college, certainly wasn't thinking about trying to keep up an estate. Yes.
That's it.
And there we are, folks. We are back to the front of the hall with this beautiful picture by our cousin, Sean Kernan. I can't thank Jennifer enough for all her hard work, everything that she did to help us with this. But those of you who followed through with us, stayed with us, came, were here, your wonderful words, it was all very encouraging, and you made every minute of what we put into this worthwhile.
Absolutely. This was so much fun. I learned a lot. You make the past seem so connectable, so real, so relatable. Just another family with family secrets, family drama. So
oh, we
yeah.
had some, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, everybody does. Who doesn't? But
Yeah.
So important. One more question. Oh, Marty, would you consider taking some of the stories or events at the hall and continuing the webinar? Pam, do you want like another webinar, or do you want to stay on? Yeah.
I'd have to dig back through my notes and see what I can come up with. How's that sound?
All right.
And Peter, as our curator, has done an absolute amazing job of coming up with information that most of us didn't know, or pictures and what have you. Hang on just a sec. You coming? Well, here he is. There he is. For those of you who wondered where LJ was, he showed up at the end. Peter has a lot of information too. So you're talking 200 years of information just with the hall alone. So we could probably come up with something.
Yeah, she's suggesting secrets, garden stories, recipes. That's 200 webinars. Absolutely. Yeah. Well,
Okay.
okay.
All right.
Yeah, people are asking to continue. So, well,
Oh,
we're
thank
taking
you.
that
Thank
into
you.
consideration. Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we'll try to do it after the weather, when the weather calms down a little bit. How's that?
Yeah, sounds
It could have been a harrowing ride up here today, except it stopped snowing. So,
excellent.
yeah.
All right, everybody, have a great night. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
holiday season.
Okay.
Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you.